The morning mist hung low over the flat Saxon plain on September 17, 1631, as two armies prepared for what would become one of history's most dramatic military encounters. On one side stood the magnificent Imperial Catholic Army, 40,000 strong, veterans of countless battles in the 30 Years' War, confident in their numerical superiority and battle-tested tactics. On the other side, the Swedish Protestant force numbered barely 12,000, augmented by reluctant Saxon allies whose commitment to the fight remained questionable at best. By day's end, the battlefield at Breitenfeld would be strewn with Imperial dead, their supposedly invincible tercios shattered, and the course of European warfare fundamentally altered forever. The Battle of Breitenfeld stands as a masterclass in how tactical innovation, disciplined training, and inspired leadership can overcome seemingly impossible odds. King Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden didn't simply defeat a numerically superior force. He systematically dismantled it, transforming medieval warfare into something recognizably modern in the space of a single afternoon. This wasn't luck or divine intervention, as contemporary propagandists on both sides claimed. It was the result of revolutionary military reforms, years in the making, combined with the tactical genius of a warrior king who understood that the nature of warfare itself was changing. The strategic context: Europe torn asunder. To understand the magnitude of what happened at Breitenfeld, we must first grasp the desperate situation facing Protestant Europe in 1631. The 30 Years' War, which had begun in 1618 as a localized rebellion in Bohemia, had metastasized into a continent-wide conflagration that threatened to extinguish Protestantism entirely. The Catholic Habsburg forces, backed by the military might of the Holy Roman Empire and the wealth of Spanish silver from the New World, had won victory after victory. The Imperial general Albrecht von Wallenstein had carved through northern Germany like a scythe through wheat. The legendary Count of Tilly, commander of the Catholic League forces, had earned his fearsome reputation by crushing Protestant armies and sacking cities with methodical brutality. The fall of Magdeburg in May 1631, where nearly 20,000 civilians perished in what became known as the Magdeburg Wedding, sent shockwaves through Protestant territories. It seemed only a matter of time before Catholic forces would reassert complete control over the German states, relegating Protestantism to a historical footnote. Into this desperate situation sailed Gustavus Adolphus, the 37-year-old King of Sweden, landing on the Pomeranian coast in July 1630 with an army that would change everything. His intervention was partly strategic. Swedish control of the Baltic was threatened by imperial expansion, and partly ideological, as the champion of Protestant Christianity. But more than anything, Gustavus brought something new, a completely reimagined approach to warfare that would render obsolete the tactical systems that had dominated European battlefields for over a century. The military revolution. Gustavus's innovations. What made the Swedish army so different? The answer lies in a comprehensive military revolution that Gustavus had implemented during his earlier wars against Denmark, Russia, and Poland. While other European powers had made incremental adjustments to their forces, Gustavus had fundamentally rethought every aspect of military organization, tactics, and technology. The Spanish tercio, which had dominated European battlefields since the early 1500s, was an impressive but increasingly obsolete formation. These massive squares of pikemen, typically 1,500 to 3,000 men strong, bristled with 16-foot pikes and were flanked by groups of musketeers. They were nearly impervious to cavalry charges and could overwhelm other infantry through sheer mass and momentum. However, they were also slow, inflexible, and vulnerable to artillery fire. Once committed to battle, a tercio was difficult to maneuver or redirect. Gustavus broke this rigid system apart and rebuilt it from scratch. His fundamental tactical unit was the squadron, containing only about 400 to 500 men arranged in formations just 6 ranks deep, compared to the tercio's 30 or more ranks. This shallow formation maximized firepower, more men could shoot at once, and dramatically improved mobility. Swedish squadrons could wheel, advance, retreat, or reform far more quickly than their imperial counterparts. But the Reformation went deeper than mere organization. Gustavus integrated his arms, infantry, cavalry, and artillery, in ways that were unprecedented. Rather than treating these as separate entities that fought their own battles within the larger engagement, he trained them to support each other continuously. Small, mobile artillery pieces, including innovative 3-pound regimental guns that could be moved by just 2 men or a single horse, were distributed throughout the infantry formations. These guns could fire devastating canister shot at close range, tearing apart enemy formations just before Swedish infantry charged with cold steel. The cavalry received similar revolutionary treatment. While Imperial cavalry still relied heavily on the caracole, a tactic where horsemen would approach the enemy, fire their pistols, then wheel away to reload, Gustavus reverted to shock tactics. His cavalrymen charged home with sword and momentum, relying on speed and impact rather than firearms. Crucially, he interspersed musketeers among his cavalry formations, allowing them to provide supporting fire before the horsemen thundered forward. The Swedish musket itself represented a technological leap. Lighter than the standard muskets of the period, the Swedish weapon could be fired without the cumbersome forked rest that other armies required. This meant Swedish musketeers could fire more rapidly and maneuver more easily. Gustavus also introduced paper cartridges containing pre-measured powder and shot, dramatically increasing the rate of fire. Where Imperial musketeers might fire once every 2 minutes, Swedish soldiers could manage 2 or even 3 shots in the same time, a difference that could prove decisive in the chaos of battle. Perhaps most importantly, Gustavus created a professional standing army. While most European forces were assembled from mercenaries who fought for whoever paid them and whose loyalty lasted exactly as long as their wages, the Swedish army was composed largely of Swedish conscripts and long-term volunteers who trained together year-round. They knew their officers, understood their tactics, and could execute complex maneuvers under fire. Discipline and morale, those intangibles that separate victorious armies from defeated ones, ran high in Swedish ranks. The Imperial Army. Confidence, bordering on arrogance. In stark contrast stood the Imperial Catholic Army under the command of Count Johann Zerkleis of Tilly. At 72 years old, Tilly was one of Europe's most experienced commanders, a veteran of the Dutch wars and countless engagements in the 30 Years' War. His reputation as a tactician was well earned, his personal courage beyond question. But Tilly was also a man of his era, steeped in tactical doctrines that had brought him victory for decades. His army of 40,000 represented the cream of Imperial and Catholic League forces. The corps consisted of experienced Spanish and Italian tercios, formations that had dominated European warfare since the days of the great captain, Gonzalo Fernandez de Córdoba. These units had crushed Protestant armies at White Mountain, at Stadtlohn, and at Dessau Bridge. Supporting them were Walloon and German infantry, formidable in their own right, along with squadrons of heavy cavalry, armored cuirassiers whose charge could break lesser formations. Tilly's artillery park was impressive, with heavy guns that could batter fortifications or tear apart enemy formations at range. His army was well supplied, disciplined, and confident. Why shouldn't they be? The Swedes were numerically inferior, fighting far from home, and had yet to face the full might of Imperial forces in a major engagement. Tilly's intelligence suggested that Gustavus had barely 20,000 men, including unreliable Saxon auxiliaries who might flee at the first cannon shot. In Tilly's worldview, shaped by decades of successful campaigns, the Swedish king was a regional power punching above his weight. Yes, Gustavus had won battles in Poland and Russia, but those were against inferior opponents using outdated tactics. Now he would face professional soldiers using the proven Spanish system. Numbers, experience, and tactical superiority all favored the Imperials. The outcome seemed predetermined. This confidence, this certainty born of past success, would prove to be a critical weakness. Tilly failed to adequately scout or assess the true nature of the Swedish tactical system. He didn't grasp that he was facing not just another army, but a completely different approach to warfare. It was as if a medieval knight, confident in his armor and lance, had been transported forward to face a rifleman. The knight's courage and skill were real, but they addressed problems that no longer mattered. The march to battle. Saxony's desperate gamble. The immediate catalyst for Breitenfeld was Saxony's decision to finally choose sides. Elector John George III of Saxony had maintained precarious neutrality, trying to avoid the war's devastation while playing Protestant and Catholic powers against each other. But Tilly's demand that Saxony provide winter quarters for imperial troops forced John George's hand. Reluctantly, he allied with Sweden, providing 18,000 Saxon troops to augment Gustavus's forces. This alliance was fragile, built on desperation rather than trust. The Saxon troops were poorly trained, inadequately equipped, and led by nobles whose military experience was limited. John George himself was no warrior king like Gustavus. Nevertheless, the combined Swedish-Saxon force now numbered about 30,000 to 40,000 men, making it comparable in size to Tilly's army, at least on paper. Tilly, upon learning of Saxony's defection, marched to confront this new alliance before it could consolidate. He wanted to crush the Saxons quickly, demonstrating the cost of opposing imperial power and ideally catching the Swedish forces before they could properly coordinate with their new allies. The armies converged on the plains near Breitenfeld, just north of Leipzig, in mid-September 1631. The battlefield. Terrain and deployment. The battlefield itself was remarkably flat and open, offering few natural obstacles or defensive positions. This suited both commanders, as their tactical systems relied on massed formations maneuvering in the open. However, the terrain would prove more favorable to the flexible Swedish system than to the ponderous imperial tercios. On the morning of September 17th, both armies deployed for battle. Tilly arranged his forces in the traditional manner. His 17 tercios formed the center in one massive line, with cavalry on each wing. His heavy guns were positioned at intervals along the line, ready to pound enemy formations before the infantry engaged. It was a conventional deployment, reflecting decades of tactical orthodoxy. Gustavus deployed his smaller force with characteristic innovation. His Swedish infantry formed the center in two lines, with the squadrons arranged in a checkerboard pattern that allowed for mutual support and created gaps through which his mobile artillery could fire. The Saxon troops, in whom he had little confidence, were positioned on the left wing, a placement that would prove prophetic. Swedish and Finnish cavalry under Gustav Horn took position on the left to support the Saxons, while Gustavus himself commanded the Swedish and German cavalry on the right wing. Crucially, Gustavus held back reserves, something Tilly's all-or-nothing deployment lacked. These reserves, positioned behind the main line, could be committed to exploit opportunities or shore up weaknesses as the battle developed. This flexibility, built into the deployment itself, reflected the fundamental difference in military philosophy between the two commanders. The opening salvos, artillery and psychology. The battle began around noon with a thunderous artillery exchange. Tilly's heavy guns opened fire first, their solid shot crashing into Swedish lines. Men died in sprays of blood and bone, their bodies torn apart by iron balls. But the Swedish formations, deployed in their shallow, dispersed squadrons, presented far less concentrated targets than traditional formations. Casualties were relatively light. The Swedish response revolutionized battlefield artillery. Rather than engaging in a lengthy duel with Imperial guns, the mobile Swedish pieces immediately began targeting Tilly's massed tercios. The effect was devastating. 3-pound and 4-pound balls slammed into the dense formations, each shot creating paths of destruction through men standing shoulder to shoulder. The lighter regimental guns, positioned between infantry squadrons, added their fire to the barrage, while larger pieces continued to pound the Imperial lines. For over 2 hours, this artillery exchange continued, with neither side advancing. Tilly's guns were more numerous and heavier, but the Swedish guns were more mobile and better integrated with the infantry. They could be moved quickly to concentrate fire on specific targets, then displaced before Imperial return fire could find them. This mobility, combined with higher rates of fire made possible by pre-packaged ammunition, gave the Swedes an edge in what seemed like a conventional artillery duel. More importantly, the prolonged bombardment tested the psychological endurance of both armies. Standing under artillery fire without being able to respond or advance requires iron discipline. The soldiers must simply endure as comrades fall around them, trusting that their turn to fight will come. The Swedish troops, professional soldiers who trained constantly, maintained their formations despite casualties. The Imperial tercios, equally professional, likewise held their ground. But the psychological strain accumulated with each passing minute. The Imperial attack, traditional power. Unleashed, finally, around 2 p.m., Tilly ordered his right wing forward. Imperial cavalry, supported by infantry from the tercios, advanced against the Swedish left, where the unreliable Saxon forces stood. This was a calculated decision. Break the weaker Allied contingent first, then roll up the Swedish line from the flank. The Imperial attack was executed with professional competence. Cavalry thundered forward while infantry advanced in support, their pikes lowered in a bristling forest of steel. The sight was terrifying. Thousands of armored men and horses bearing down in a tide of martial power that had broken armies across Europe. The Saxon troops, already unnerved by the artillery bombardment and facing their first major battle, broke almost immediately. Some units fired a few volleys before fleeing, while others simply dissolved into a panicked rout without offering significant resistance. Elector John George himself fled the field, his army scattering across the countryside. Within minutes, the entire Swedish left flank had evaporated, exposing Gustavus's position to envelopment. From Tilly's perspective, the battle was unfolding perfectly. The Saxons had fled as expected, and his forces now threatened to roll up the Swedish flank. Victory seemed assured. The numerically inferior Swedish force was about to be attacked from multiple directions, the nightmare scenario for any commander. Gustavus's response: flexibility under fire. But Gustavus Adolphus was not an ordinary commander. As the Saxon rout became evident, he demonstrated the composure and tactical genius that would define his reputation. Rather than panicking or attempting futile efforts to rally the fleeing Saxons, he immediately recognized the opportunity hidden within the crisis. He ordered his second line to wheel left, pivoting to face the new threat from the exposed flank. This maneuver, which would have been nearly impossible for the rigid Imperial tercios, was executed smoothly by the trained Swedish squadrons. Within minutes, What had been a disaster transformed into a new defensive line facing the advancing Imperial right wing. Simultaneously, Gustavus dispatched Gustav Horn with cavalry to harass and delay the Imperial advance, buying time for the infantry to complete their redeployment. These delaying tactics, combined with the natural disorganization that occurs when pursuing a routing enemy, slowed the Imperial attack just enough. The Swedish infantry, now reoriented, opened fire with devastating effect. The mobile artillery pieces added their weight, firing canister shot at close range into the packed Imperial formations. The rate of Swedish musket fire astonished the Imperial troops. 2 or 3 volleys in the time they expected one. Men fell in heaps as the Swedish firepower tore into their ranks. Yet the Imperial right wing continued to press forward. These were veteran soldiers, not easily deterred by casualties. They closed with the Swedish infantry in brutal hand-to-hand combat, pikes clashing against pikes, swords against musket stocks. The fighting was savage, intimate, and desperate. For a time, the outcome hung in balance, professional soldiers on both sides trading blows in a grinding melee. The decisive maneuver, Gustavus's cavalry charge. While the Swedish left struggled to contain the Imperial right, Gustavus recognized that his enemy had committed a fatal error. Tilly's assault on the Swedish left had drawn forces away from his center and right. The Imperial formation, already less flexible than the Swedish system, was now stretched and vulnerable. Gustavus made his decision: attack. Leading his right-wing cavalry personally, the King of Sweden launched a massive assault against the Imperial left. But this was no mere cavalry charge. In accordance with his integrated tactical system, Swedish infantry and artillery moved forward in support, their fire suppressing the Imperial guns and infantry before the cavalry struck home. The charge was devastating. Swedish and German horsemen crashed into the Imperial cavalry with shocking violence, their momentum and numbers overwhelming the defenders. Unlike the caracole tactics of their opponents, the Swedish cavalry didn't wheel away after firing pistols. They charged home with cold steel, engaging in a savage melee that broke the cohesion of the Imperial left wing. As the Imperial cavalry reeled backward, Gustavus didn't pause to consolidate. Instead, he exploited the breakthrough immediately, wheeling his cavalry to attack the exposed flank of the Imperial tercios in the center. This was the nightmare scenario for the Spanish formations: attack from the side where their pike walls couldn't protect them, and their own rigid structure prevented rapid redeployment. The Swedish cavalry, supported now by infantry squadrons that had wheeled to follow up the breakthrough, tore into the Imperial center. The tercios, magnificent formations when facing frontal assault, were helpless against this flanking attack. Their officers attempted to reform, to wheel their units to face the new threat, but the massive formations could not maneuver quickly enough. Swedish musket fire poured into their flanks, while cavalry carved through their ranks. The collapse, Imperial army shattered. What followed was the systematic destruction of Tilly's army. The Imperial center, attacked from the side and subjected to coordinated fire from multiple Swedish units, began to disintegrate. Individual tercios attempted to form defensive squares, but Swedish artillery moved forward to pound them at close range, while musketeers poured fire into the packed formations. The Imperial right wing, which had seemed on the verge of victory against the Swedish left, now found itself isolated and facing encirclement. As news of the disaster in the center spread, units began to waver. Some attempted to retreat in good order, while others broke and ran. The Swedish forces, sensing victory, pressed their advantage ruthlessly. Tilly himself was wounded in the fighting, taking 3 musket balls and barely escaping the field. His subordinate commanders attempted to organize a fighting retreat, but the cohesion of the Imperial army had shattered. What had been one of Europe's most formidable military forces dissolved into a mass of fleeing soldiers desperate to escape Swedish pursuit. The Swedes captured the entire Imperial artillery train, all of Tilly's heavy guns, representing both enormous material value and psychological significance. They also seized the Imperial baggage train, pay chests, and supplies. The battlefield itself became a charnel house, strewn with thousands of Imperial dead and dying. The pursuit continued into the night and the following day. Swedish cavalry hunted down fleeing Imperial soldiers, capturing or killing thousands more. By the time the remnants of Tilly's army finally reached safety, he had lost over 13,000 dead and 6,000 captured, nearly half his entire force. Thousands more were wounded or had simply deserted, melting away into the German countryside. The Swedish losses, by contrast, were remarkably light, perhaps 2,000 dead and wounded, mostly from the initial Imperial assault on the left wing. The Saxons had suffered fewer casualties simply because they had fled so quickly. The tactical victory. Why the Swedes won. The Battle of Breitenfeld was not simply a victory. It was a revolution in military affairs witnessed in real time. Several factors combined to produce the Swedish triumph over seemingly impossible odds. First and foremost was the Swedish tactical system itself. The flexibility of the squadron formations, the integration of infantry, cavalry, and artillery, the superior rate of fire. All of these innovations translated into concrete battlefield advantages. When the Saxons fled and exposed the Swedish flank, the tercios could not have responded as quickly as the Swedish squadrons did. When Gustavus saw his opportunity to attack the Imperial left, his cavalry could execute the complex assault with infantry support in ways Imperial forces simply could not match. Second was the quality of Swedish training and discipline. These were professional soldiers who drilled constantly and understood their role in the larger tactical system. They could execute complex maneuvers under fire, maintain cohesion in the chaos of battle, and adapt to changing circumstances. The Imperial forces were equally brave and experienced, but they were trained in a different system that emphasized mass and momentum rather than flexibility and firepower. Third was leadership. Gustavus Adolphus was not just a king who observed battles from a safe distance. He was a warrior who led from the front and understood tactics at an intuitive level. His ability to recognize the opportunity created by the Imperial right wing's advance, to make instant decisions about redeploying his forces, and to personally lead the decisive cavalry charge demonstrated military genius of the highest order. Fourth was the technological advantage, particularly in artillery and small arms. The lighter, more mobile Swedish guns could concentrate fire more effectively than heavier Imperial pieces. The faster-loading Swedish muskets delivered substantially more firepower. These advantages, while individually modest, accumulated into decisive superiority. Finally, there was the psychological dimension. Tilly's confidence, born of decades of success, made him underestimate his opponent. He failed to adequately scout the Swedish positions or assess the true nature of their tactical system. He committed his forces in a conventional manner against an unconventional opponent. By the time he realized the depth of his mistake, it was too late. The strategic aftermath, shifting the balance of power. The immediate strategic consequences of Breitenfeld were enormous. In a single afternoon, the myth of Imperial invincibility had been shattered. Protestant morale, in despair after the fall of Magdeburg, soared. Suddenly, the war that seemed lost appeared winnable. Gustavus Adolphus, no longer a regional power to be dismissed, became the champion of Protestant Europe, and a force that even the mighty Habsburgs had to respect. German Protestant princes who had hesitated to support him now flocked to his banner. The political landscape of the Holy Roman Empire shifted decisively. The Swedish king followed up his victory with a triumphant march through Germany. Cities and territories that had submitted to imperial control welcomed him as a liberator. Over the winter of 1631 to 1632, Gustavus established Swedish power deep in the heart of Germany, occupying Bavaria and threatening Habsburg lands directly. Tilly's shattered army required months to rebuild. The old general, wounded in body and reputation, would never fully recover from the defeat. He died the following year from wounds received in another battle against Gustavus, his final campaign a futile attempt to stop the Swedish tide. The imperial cause was forced to recall Albrecht von Wallenstein, who had been dismissed earlier due to political intrigues. Only Wallenstein, with his genius for organization and his mercenary armies, seemed capable of confronting the Swedish threat. The stage was set for even larger confrontations, culminating in the Battle of Lutzen in 1632, where Gustavus would win another victory but lose his life. The Military Revolution. Long-term impact. But perhaps the most significant consequence of Breitenfeld was not strategic, but doctrinal. The battle demonstrated conclusively that the era of the tercio was over. Every major European power took note of the Swedish system and began implementing similar reforms. The lesson was clear. Flexibility, firepower, and the integration of different arms were the future of warfare. Smaller, more maneuverable formations supported by mobile artillery and disciplined cavalry would dominate battlefields for the next century. The Swedish model, with various modifications and improvements, became the standard that all European armies sought to emulate. The pike itself, which had dominated European warfare since the Swiss victories of the 15th century, began its long decline. As firepower became more important and formations became more flexible, the pike's defensive utility diminished. Within a generation, infantry formations would consist almost entirely of musketeers, with the pike retained only for special purposes or as a ceremonial weapon. Artillery continued its evolution toward lighter, more mobile pieces that could move with the infantry rather than remaining in static positions. The concept of regimental guns, pioneered by Gustavus, became standard practice. Artillery officers became specialists in their own right, rather than civilian technicians hired for campaigns. Cavalry tactics shifted decisively toward shock action and away from the caracole. The image of horsemen firing pistols and wheeling away, which had seemed so sophisticated earlier in the century, now appeared absurd compared to the devastating impact of a proper cavalry charge. The psychological and physical shock of cavalry striking home in a coordinated assault proved far more effective than mounted pistol fire. Professional standing armies gradually replaced mercenary forces throughout Europe. The Swedish example demonstrated that soldiers who trained together year-round and maintained their units between campaigns were far more effective than mercenaries assembled for individual conflicts. This professionalization would culminate in the great standing armies of Louis XIV's France and other absolutist states. Myths and realities. Separating fact from legend. Any battle as dramatic as Breitenfeld inevitably becomes encrusted with myths and exaggerations. Protestant propaganda portrayed it as divine intervention, God's hand striking down the Catholic oppressors. Catholic accounts tried to minimize the defeat, blaming it on Saxon cowardice or on Tilly's age and wounds rather than Swedish tactical superiority. Modern analysis reveals a more complex reality. The numbers themselves have been debated. Some sources claim even greater numerical disparities, while others suggest the forces were more evenly matched when the Saxons are included. The figure of 12,000 Swedes against 40,000 Imperials specifically excludes the Saxon troops, who fled so quickly they contributed little to the battle's outcome. The scale of the victory, however, is not disputed. By any measure, Gustavus achieved a decisive triumph over a larger, experienced enemy force. Whether the precise ratio was 1.3 or 1.2 matters less than the fact that he systematically defeated an opponent that should have crushed him. Some historians have suggested that Tilly's age and the defensive quality of his tactics contributed to the defeat. There is truth to this. At 72, Tilly was past his prime, and his decision to remain largely on the defensive allowed Gustavus to seize the initiative. Yet this explanation feels insufficient. Plenty of elderly generals have won battles, and Tilly's tactical approach had succeeded in previous engagements. The more convincing explanation is that he was simply employing obsolete methods against a revolutionary system. The role of fortune cannot be dismissed entirely. The Saxon collapse, while predictable, could have gone differently. If John George's troops had fought with determination, they might have held long enough for Gustavus to execute his plan with less risk. Conversely, if the Imperial right wing had broken through the redeployed Swedish left before Gustavus's cavalry charge could be launched, the outcome might have been reversed. Battle is inherently chaotic, and luck plays its role. Yet fortune favors the prepared. Gustavus's system was designed to exploit opportunities and mitigate disasters. His flexible formations could respond to unexpected developments. His reserves could shore up weaknesses or exploit breakthroughs. His personal leadership meant that decisions could be made instantly, rather than waiting for messengers to traverse the battlefield. All of these factors converted potential disasters into manageable problems and potential opportunities into decisive advantages. The human dimension. Soldiers in the chaos. Behind the tactical analysis and strategic consequences lie the experiences of thousands of individual soldiers who fought and died at Breitenfeld. For them, the battle was not an elegant demonstration of military principles, but a terrifying ordeal of fire, steel, and chaos. The Swedish infantryman standing in his 6-deep squadron, loading and firing his musket with well-drilled efficiency, while cannonballs screamed overhead. What went through his mind as the Saxons fled and his formation wheeled to face the new threat? Did he trust his officers and his training, or did he contemplate following the Saxons in their flight? The Imperial pikeman in the center tercio, confident in the massive formation around him, until Swedish cavalry suddenly appeared on his flank. How did he reconcile his training and experience with the reality that his supposedly impregnable formation was being torn apart? The cavalryman following Gustavus Adolphus in that decisive charge, galloping toward the Imperial guns with sword raised, uncertain whether he would live to see another sunrise, what courage or desperation drove him forward? These individual experiences, multiplied thousands of times, constitute the true reality of battle. The tactical principles and strategic consequences matter, but they matter because they determined whether these men lived or died, won or lost, experienced triumph or tragedy. The aftermath of battle was no less horrific. Thousands of wounded men lay on the field, crying for help that would come too late or not at all. Medical care in the 17th century was primitive. Wounds that would be survivable today meant agonizing deaths from infection. The dead were stripped by looters and left to rot or be buried in mass graves. Civilians in the surrounding countryside faced plunder from both victorious Swedes and fleeing Imperials. Gustavus Adolphus. The lion of the North Central to Breitenfeld's outcome was the personality and genius of Gustavus Adolphus himself. Born in 1594, he had ascended to the Swedish throne at age 16 and spent his entire reign at war. By 1631, he was already a seasoned warrior with victories against Denmark, Russia, and Poland. But more than just a fighter, he was a thinker who understood that warfare was evolving and that old methods would not suffice. His reforms were comprehensive, touching every aspect of Swedish society and military organization. He modernized Sweden's administration to support a standing army, implemented a national conscription system that provided steady manpower, established military schools to train officers, and invested in weapons manufacturing. He read widely in military history and theory, learning from classical authors and contemporary theorists alike. Yet for all his intellectual approach to warfare, Gustavus was no armchair general. He led from the front, sharing the dangers his soldiers faced and earning their fierce loyalty. At Breitenfeld, he personally commanded the decisive cavalry charge that broke the Imperial left. This combination of theoretical insight and practical courage made him the most formidable military leader of his generation. His death at Lutzen in 1632, less than a year after Breitenfeld, robbed the Protestant cause of its greatest champion and Europe of a military genius. Yet his reforms and the system he created survived him, carried forward by subordinates like Lennart Torstensson and adopted by other nations. In this sense, Gustavus's influence extended far beyond his lifetime. Conclusion: a pivotal moment in military history. The Battle of Breitenfeld stands as one of history's most significant military engagements, not merely because of the dramatic disparity in numbers or the decisiveness of the Swedish victory, but because it marked a fundamental transition in the nature of warfare. The medieval world's final echoes, the massive pike formations, the emphasis on shock and mass over maneuver and firepower, met the emerging modern system and were found catastrophically wanting. Gustavus Adolphus's 12,000 soldiers didn't just defeat 40,000 imperial troops through luck or courage, though both played their roles. They won because they represented the future fighting the past, because they embodied a systematic rethinking of military organization that made them qualitatively superior despite their numerical inferiority. The flexibility of their formations, the integration of their arms, the professionalism of their training, the effectiveness of their equipment, all combined to create an army that could accomplish what seemed impossible. The reverberations of that September afternoon in 1631 echoed across centuries. Every major European military reform for the next 100 years referenced the Swedish system. The professionalization of armies, the emphasis on combined arms operations, the evolution of tactics toward flexibility and firepower. These developments traced their lineage back to Gustavus and the army he forged. For commanders and military theorists, Breitenfeld offers timeless lessons. Innovation matters. Armies that cling to obsolete methods face defeat regardless of their numbers or courage. Training and discipline convert tactical theory into battlefield reality. Leadership at the critical moment can transform potential disaster into decisive victory. Integration of different capabilities produces effects greater than the sum of individual parts. Flexibility allows adaptation to unexpected developments and exploitation of fleeting opportunities. The battle also reminds us that military history is not merely an abstract study of tactics and strategies, but a human story of courage and fear, genius and error, triumph and tragedy. Thousands of men fought and died at Breitenfeld, their individual stories lost to history, but their collective sacrifice shaping the world that followed. The Swedish victory preserved Protestant Europe, altered the balance of power, and demonstrated that the seemingly impossible could be achieved through innovation, training, and inspired leadership. In the end, Breitenfeld represents one of those rare moments when everything changes, when the old order breaks and something new emerges from its fragments. King Gustavus Adolphus and his Swedish soldiers didn't just win a battle that day, they revolutionized warfare itself, leaving a legacy that extends from the 30 Years' War to modern military doctrine.